Hello, bird nerds. It's Monday, and that means it's the best day of the week. There is no Mondayitis in Bird Nerd World, and Bird Nerd World today is especially glorious because me, Grant Williams, Bird Nerd, gets to speak to Dr. Holly Parsons. Hello, Holly.
Morning. You could say it's superb today.
It's splendid.
Lovely.
And with the patchy sky, maybe it's variegated. Who knows? But Holly, of course, is the Urban Birds Program Manager at BirdLife Australia. We are super privileged today to be joined by Dr. Joe Welklin. Hi, Joe.
Hi, Grant. Thanks for having me.
Are you the originator of the Fairywren Project, or the director, or the czar, Fairywren czar?
Yes. All above. It's the Fairywren Project is a citizen science project run by my colleague Allison Johnson and I. We're both based in the U.S., but we study Australian fairy.
That's pretty wild, isn't it, Holly? As Joe just said, he's based in the U.S. at the University of Nevada. Now, I was stunned when I learnt that both Joe and Allison were based in the U.S. because I was thinking, Fairywrens, our special little birds, aren't they? So how did that come about, Joe?
Yeah, there's a lot of reasons to study fairywrens, even if you're coming across the world, pretty much on the opposite side of the world from us. They're a really interesting species because they're, for multiple reasons. One, because they're, as your listeners may have heard before, that they're cooperative breeders. Offspring often, their parents raise new offspring, so they're raising their siblings. And they exhibit these really, as you've seen, these really colorful plumage types, which is what I'm interested in. And so there's a sort of a tradition of of Americans studying fairywrens in Australia, and we're continuing that tradition.
I put a question out on Twitter earlier on, and nobody got back to me with their sort of answer. But Joe, what is the equivalent of the fairywren group or the genus in the US, which I know in England and in Europe we've got the true wren, but what is the equivalent to our bunch of fairywrens in your neck of the woods?
That's a great question. I think that we have true wrens in the United States as well, in North America and South America, but they're not. But the true wrens, so the one I'm most familiar with is the Carolina wren that's native to the eastern United States. They're not closely related to fairywrens at all. They're really separate. So fairywrens are part of their own sort of Australian clade of birds. But I think their behavior is somewhat similar. Their tails often are cocked straight up like fairywrens are. But in other species, I've just moved west to Nevada from the eastern United States. And out here out west, we have what are called bush tits. And they're tiny little birds like fairywrens, and they're often cooperative breeders like fairywrens.
I think so.
So the offspring will help their parents raise more offspring like fairywrens do. And they're really funny because they move through bushes and forage together like wren groups do. So they, maybe even more than the true wrens, they remind me of fairywrens a lot out here. Now,
Holly, you're a bird scientist as well. What are fairywrens most closely related to? Before you answer, I always think that they look like, I always think that they look a lot like Australian robins, when I look at them, just the proportion of their legs and to their body and things like that. But I'm probably wrong. What do you reckon? I know, I'm a bastard.
I know. I should know the answer to this and I can't. I'm sitting there thinking scrub wren. They're going to be closely related to scrub wrens, and probably the thornbills and things, I think, are probably the next.
And you'd have to.
Joe's just going to be laughing at me going.
Yeah, emu wrens are obviously part of that offshoot.
And grass wrens.
Yeah, grass wrens. And of course, who hasn't got a grass wren on their bucket list of birds that they want to see?
Yeah.
Are they an ancient family, Joe?
That's a good question. I think so. I'm not as up to date with the phylogeny some others are. But yeah, they're part of the large Australian passerine group, which has been separate from many other passerine songbirds for many years. The Australian species has evolved on their own for many years, separately from many other groups.
Yeah. They're songbirds in the truest sense of the word, aren't they? In that so much of the way their behaviour and their social interactions are structured revolve around the various songs. We can probably get back to that a little bit later, but first I'm really interested in the genesis of the Fairywren Project. How did it start up, and how long's it been going, and who's been supporting the work that you've been doing?
I'll start with the last question. Like many things in science, it starts with an idea that you don't have funding for, and so you just try it and launch it and see if it's going to work. So far, Alison and I, my colleague, have just been doing this as a side project. We put a fair bit of work into it, but it's not where we're getting our funding from, or our living expenses from. And so we don't have any funding currently. We're currently applying for grants in the United States, for big research grants, and hoping to get one of those soon, but we'll see what happens. And so yeah, right now this is just our fun side project that we're going to try and eventually turn into our full-time research project if we can get funding and find academic positions.
That's a really common issue in science research generally, but Holly, seems to be a bit of support from BirdLife, because I think there's a whole separate page, isn't there, on BirdLife? Where are we?
For the Fairywren Project, BirdLife doesn't support us, and we haven't asked for BirdLife for any funding. We've just been doing everything on our own, but we do, if people come to us asking if they can donate to our project, we actually tell them to go to BirdLife, because we can't, we don't think we can fund our project off small donations or just one-time donations. Yeah. It would take a lot of money to do the research we want to. So we're waiting out for these big government grants and sending these one-time donors or these monthly donors to conservation organizations and research organizations, big organizations like BirdLife, who can put that to use in many different ways.
I love your website, your webpage. Please tell me that someone is paying for that for you.
I designed almost all the website, and Alison did all the drawings on the Meet the Fairywrens page.
But someone's hosting it for you and whatnot for nothing, I hope, are they?
It's pretty cheap to host now on your own if you want to. So we do that with some leftover research money we have.
Cool.
Yeah.
I encourage everyone to go and have a look, because it's a really great site. Let's get into the hard-hitting questions. Holly, I'd like your opinion on this one too. How many species of fairywren are there, Joe, and how many subspecies or races?
If you start in Australia, there are currently 10 recognized species in Australia. And then I always forget exactly how many are in New Guinea. I think it's either 5 or 6, but I always forget how many species are up there. And then subspecies and races, there's a lot. I just put it in a paper we published, and now I forget what it is, but I think it's over 20, probably subspecies, but I don't remember for sure. Most of the species do have at least 1 or 2 subspecies, but yeah, maybe not all of them, but many of them do.
Holly, what's your opinion?
So, there's 10 species of Australian fairywrens, or fairywrens found in Australia, as Joe has said. I am looking at Wikipedia.
So am I, and I'm thinking there's a super cool name. We've got the Superb and the Splendid, but New Guinea have got the Emperor. They're super grandiose.
They are. Most of the fairywrens are found in Australia, and there are a couple that are found in through New Guinea, including, what else have we got? Orange-crowned fairywren as well. But yes, the Emperor sounds very impressive, and I think there's a competition amongst the fairywrens for some very attractive-looking birds.
I think there's 16 species total. I'm looking at Birds of the World from Cornell right now. And I think, so there's in New Guinea, you have the orange-crowned, you have the Emperor, you have Wallace's fairywren, which is a really old fairywren. It's been separated for a long time. There's the broad-billed fairywren and Campbell's fairywren and the white-shouldered fairywren as well.
And of course, the purpose of asking that question is that taxonomy is always fraught. It's always based on observations and opinion, behaviours and whatnot, but we've moved into that brave new world where genetic testing is now available at a price many scientists can afford if they don't want to maintain a second car or something like that, or buy a house. How did you come up with your 10, the typing of 10 species?
Is this question for me or for...
Yeah, because I don't think Holly's published the paper.
I guess we just follow who we call the experts, and we follow Cornell and the taxonomy. They use the specific taxonomy, I think the Clements taxonomy. There's different organizations that put out taxonomies across the world that you can pull from. But we use Cornell's because the Fairywren Project research ties in so closely to eBird, which is a Cornell program. And so that's the simplest for us. If our users are using or participants are using eBird, then we're just using the same taxonomy that they're using.
What kind of genetic work was done, maybe not necessarily by you, but to support the work that you've been doing? Is it blood, feathers, eggshells? I don't know. Tell us how it's done.
Usually, yeah. It's done from museum specimens. And when people want to build a taxonomy, say, of the fairywrens or phylogeny of the fairywrens to see what the evolutionary relationships are, they'll often take DNA from museum specimens. And often the collections managers at museums are funny because they don't want you messing up the specimens because they want to keep them as pure as possible. And so the one thing that they're usually okay with people taking are not really feathers. If you can avoid it, they don't want you to take feathers, and they don't want you to take any other parts if they can avoid it. But they will let you often take toe pads. So like on the inside of the foot of a bird, it has the pads on each of the segments of the foot, and people will cut those off and disintegrate those in solution, and then you can get DNA from those toe pads. And using those, you can get the DNA characteristics or even the full genome of the species. And usually you pull from different populations as well to get a representative estimate of the species. And then you put those into a comparison plot to build a phylogeny.
Did you know that, Holly, about the foot pads?
I didn't. Fascinating.
Me either. And I've talked to a lot of people who've done a lot of genetic work and no one's ever mentioned that. So thanks, Joe. That was the price of admission.
Very cool.
And I'd always wondered how, I probably should have asked the question since I've got the show and the access, but I've always wondered how that transfer of material happened from the museum to the researcher, or actually to the lab. I guess sometimes it would just go direct to the lab, wouldn't it? They don't want it getting lost in the post between the museum and you. And I'm guessing most museums probably have an arrangement with a local lab anyway, and then you would get those results. Is that how it works?
It depends. I think a lot of people do like to run all the samples themselves. So I think a lot of times museums will send samples to a research group that's doing the study. And then the person doing the study usually likes to do all the lab work themselves so they know they did everything correctly. Or if they mess up, they can at least blame themselves instead of blaming someone else. We're paranoid that way as scientists.
Yeah. Holly, the advances in genetic testing and the availability to ornithology generally, has that made a big difference in the way projects are now designed and done from your point of view at BirdLife?
Look, it opens up new avenues to explore and apply that sort of understanding of the genetic population to on-ground conservation work. We don't have a lab at BirdLife to do that sort of testing. We've got relationships with museums, but we recently did some work with the Powerful Owl Project looking at the relatedness of powerful owls in Greater Sydney through the collection of feathers on the ground. So using eDNA to look at how our different powerful owl pairs are related or not related. And the idea behind that is then we can look and see, how is the genetic material travelling around Sydney? Is it travelling around, or are we getting isolated populations because potentially the canopy isn't there to allow birds to move across the landscape, even though we think that they are big owls and they should be able to fly? So I should have some good results to talk to you about on that very soon, because we've got some more results back recently. But yeah, just from a feather on the ground, you can start to uncover these sort of interrelationships amongst a bird population, and it has practical on-ground outcomes. It's fascinating.
In the US, and so is Alison. So have you been able to do any on-ground work here with the fairy wrens? Have you been out collecting feathers, for instance?
Yeah, so I did my PhD on red-backed fairy wrens, and I spent in total probably over 2 years in Queensland, Australia, just outside of Brisbane, just to the west of Brisbane. researching the redback fairy wrens there, chasing them around a field site for, I think, 5 field seasons. So anywhere from 3 months to 6 months at a time, I was on the ground collecting feathers and blood samples and following the redback fairy wrens.
They're very little birds, delicate. Are they easy to trap? Because you're obviously, if you're taking blood samples, you must be trapping them. So are they easy to trap, and are they difficult to handle?
Yeah, good question. I think compared to some species, they are easy to trap, but compared to others, they're not super easy. It depends. So if you only want to catch a bird once, sometimes you can, to catch them in general, for fairy wrens, you almost always have to put up a mist net, which is anywhere from a 6 meter long net to a 12 meter long net that stands usually about 2 meters high. And it's made of really fine mesh that tends to blend in really with vegetation. If you put it right up against a set of bushes, it blends in really well, to the point where we even sometimes run into the nets if other people set them and we don't know they're there. And if you only want to catch a fairy wren once, a lot of times you can just, especially if it's during the breeding season, you can play that species song from a speaker, and you put the speaker below the net, and the resident bird, especially the resident male, but sometimes the female too, will come in thinking there's an intruder on its territory and try and find the intruder and usually fly right into your net. But once you've done that, they tend to remember that being captured using that song. And so it's much harder to catch them like twice using song like that. You can also, when you get really good, you can, since fairy wrens don't like to fly very high, they like to stay generally low in the grass or low in bushes. If you have multiple people, you can herd them into nets. What we would do during the non-breeding season when they didn't really care about song very much, is we'd put up 2 or 3 12-meter nets in a line, like connected. And we'd get 3 or 4 people, and we'd first find the birds, then set up nearby, and then we'd walk out around the birds and slowly spread out and just move the birds towards the nets. And they would generally fly into the nets. Not always. Sometimes they'd go over, but generally they'd go in.
Mustering.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Very cool. We've established, or we've accepted, I don't think you ever establish anything in this kind of discussion, but we've accepted that there's 10 species in Australia. Do you want to run us through which ones they are and the niche that they occupy in their distribution? And then maybe we can talk about the differences and the distribution, the geographic distribution of them.
Yeah, sure. Let's start with
the redback, yeah?
Okay, sure. Yeah, so the redback fairy wren the male is known for this jet black plumage on his everywhere but his back. His middle to lower, or upper to lower back is this bright red plumage or bright orange. So there's 2 subspecies to redback fairy wrens. The ones on the east coast of Australia are the orange subspecies, or oranger. They're still pretty red. But if you go to the far north, all the way over a little bit past, a little bit past the York Peninsula, I think, you can find the red subspecies up there. They are very red up there. It's a very deep red on their back. And the females of that species, they're all brown. It's a nice sort of tawny fawn brown color. And they're on the east coast and on the north coast, and they inhabit grassland habitat usually, or sometimes open forest with grass understory. Yeah.
And I suppose if we're going to go through these sort of segments on the page, you better tell us about the definition of bright and intermediate.
Yeah. So these are just our definitions we're using to classify their plumage. Other researchers sometimes use other definitions, and sometimes we use other definitions when we're writing our papers too. But the bright plumage is generally the ornamented or the nuptial or the breeding plumage. Generally, what the species is known for or named for is that male bright plumage. For our project, we call an intermediate male any male that is molting. So if he's going from the brown plumage to the red and black plumage, or the red and black plumage to the brown plumage, that's an intermediate male. So he's molting those feathers and replacing those feathers. And fairy wrens do that twice a year. So they do it prior to the breeding season, anywhere from a couple months prior to right before the breeding season. These males will molt from their brown, breeding plumage into their fancy breeding plumage. For the redbacks, it's the red and black plumage. And then at the end of the breeding season, they molt out of that red and black plumage into a brown plumage. So that's what you're seeing there in the middle. The dull male is the male's non-breeding plumage. So that's when most of the males look like in the winter when they're outside the breeding season.
So is it about equal length of time during the year that a male will be in the bright breeding plumage and then in the, I think what we used to call the eclipse plumage, didn't we? Intermediate plumage. I just wanted to get old-timey language in there in case any people as old as me are watching, Joe. So, yeah, is it a pretty even split of time through the year, or is it only maybe 8 weeks or something that you're going to see them in the full resplendent red and...
It's really dependent on a lot of things. And what I guess I would say, what I would call the eclipse plumage is actually the dull plumage, the non-breeding plumage. The intermediate plumage is their molt.
So
normally,
is the eclipse.
Yeah. So normally they're like when they're actually molting from brown to red and black or dull to bright, the molt usually only takes a couple weeks, say 2 to 3 weeks often. But yeah, for timing of when they're in these, how long they're in these plumages, it depends a lot on the male's age and environmental conditions that year. So at least for redback fairywrens and for superb fairywrens and red-winged fairywrens, the older males tend to acquire their bright plumage earlier than younger males. And they do this months before the breeding season begins. So the redback fairywrens that I studied outside of Brisbane, they start breeding usually in August or September, but males were acquiring their red and black plumage as early as May or even before then. Some of them, I would usually arrive in May, and there were often males already in red and black plumage when I arrived. So if anything, they're probably spending more of the year in their bright breeding plumage than they are in the dull non-breeding plumage.
And some of them, Joe, might skip the dull plumage altogether, don't they? Like some of the better quality, older, at least with superbs, will have a molt but stay bright.
We do know with superbs and redback fairywrens, and probably others too, it's just the ones that it's been established in, they can, maintain, some males can maintain the bright breeding plumage year-round. For superbs, it seems like they have a hard time doing that multiple years in a row. That it must be probably energetically costly for them to do that. But they can, some old males can do that multiple years, or at least 2 years. They can be in bright plumage for 2 full years.
Let's go to the superb, and I'm going to guess, Joe, that Holly has some local superb fairywrens near her place that she might know fairly well. I used to have 2 family groups. I assume it was 2 family groups. It may actually have been one big group. After I spoke to Ettore, he told me how big the colonies, or what do we call them? Yeah, what's the correct group? If I've got 20 of them hanging around, I had those in my own mind identified as two different groups. But are we calling them a colony, a flock, a battalion, platoon?
I forget what Ettore called them in his paper. I've been calling them communities. So I think you're right. You probably do at least 2 separate family groups, but then they often get together to interact in a larger, what I would call a community.
And sorry, Joe, as I'm referencing Ettore, I did do, for Pint of Science last year, interviewed Ettore, who'd been studying the superb fairywren, and I think we established that there's no such thing as fidelity within these groups. I think both sexes get around, don't they?
Yes, very much, especially in superb fairywrens. They have some of the highest rates of what we call extra parent paternity in the bird world. So, both during the breeding season, both the male and female are seeking copulations with males and females from different groups. So the female is out in the early morning finding other males to mate with, and the male in the morning is waiting for other females to come to him as he's singing during the dawn chorus.
It's the best science term. So calling them socially monogamous, I think, is it's my absolute favorite term to describe a bird and its behavior. I think, it looks happy families and it's actually very sorted, and there's lots of avenues being explored by a breeding pair. It's amazing.
One thing that I got to know with my larger group was that it's very difficult for the subordinate males, and I'm sure that's the wrong terminology, but it seems very difficult for them to do anything but what they're told. I mean, they always seem to be being beat up by the couple of dominant females and a dominant male. Now, with me messing up all the terminology and with the superb fairy wren, which is the one that I think the majority of our listeners will be familiar with, just simply because of where the population spread is in Australia, how do they organise their platoon, socially monogamous battalion, group, flock? So tell us about what is the standard way they organise themselves.
Yeah, for dominant, I think dominant and subordinate's not a bad term, not bad terms to use. So normally you'd have a dominant male, who's the male in the breeding plumage, and a dominant female governing over a territory. And then they often have a helper son with them there in the territory, who is also usually in the bright breeding plumage. And for superbs, that's probably the most common group size other than pairs, other than just straight male and female pairs, having one helper son with them. But you could get groups, some areas where you have more than one helper son. In superb fairy wrens, I think it's very rare to find helper females. Normally, females disperse before their first adult breeding season. And so you only end up with sons helping their parents on their parents' territory.
Are they organised differently? No, let me phrase this a different way. All of the females chased away, like the previous year's offspring, are they chased away quite quickly and they disperse widely? Or do we know if they establish territories, infiltrate another group close by?
We think, I don't know if anybody's looked at exact distances they travel, but I believe we know they travel at least a couple kilometers, it seems like, the females do. And so there's some cool work, I think from the 90s on superb fairy wrens, where they found for females there's sort of two dispersal times. Some females disperse near the beginning of the non-breeding season, so just after the breeding season's over, they disperse pretty early. And other females wait until right before the beginning of the next breeding season to disperse. So you have these two periods, and the ones that stick around until right before the next breeding season probably are getting kicked out by their mothers. I haven't seen superb fairy wrens as much as redback fairy wrens, but I have seen female redback fairy wrens kicking out their daughters right before the beginning of the breeding season. So these females that are leaving late are probably getting kicked out. And then they do seem to travel quite a ways away. When I looked at relatedness, like Holly was talking about relatedness among powerful owls in the city, when I looked at among female redback fairy wrens at my field site, we found that in general they were pretty not very related. So the females, it seemed like, were traveling out, and the new females we were getting in were coming from different areas.
Holly, I want to give you another pop quiz question, and we'll see how we go. How long do you think the fairy wrens live?
So we know some of that. So in terms of superbs, at least, there have been some recaptured banded birds that have been about 10, but estimates are generally somewhere around 5, I think, is considered a long-lived superb fairy wren. And it's probably in an urban setting actually younger than that too. I think there are so many threats in an urban space that you're probably looking at just an average of about 3 years, I would think, in an urban setting for a superb. So they can be relatively long-lived for something that's a very small bird. But yeah, there's a lot of challenges that they face. And as Joe said, when females have to disperse to try and set up a new territory, at least in urban spaces, those potential new territories are very limited. And so re-establishing new fairy wren territories is quite challenging in an urban context because there's just not the habitat around for them.
Joe, all of the species comparable in size?
They're all pretty small compared to most other birds, I would say. But there are some minor differences. So the redback fairy wrens, the average weight was around 7 grams, I think, when I was studying them. But I think superb fairy wrens Are they around 11 or 12 even?
9 to 10, I think,
Okay,
about 10 about average. And then I think too, depending on your subspecies as well, some of the subspecies are even a little bit larger. I think Kangaroo Island.
When you have them in the hand, you do notice a difference. They do feel chunkier.
Well, that's funny. I've only held superbs in the hand, and it feels like you're not actually holding anything at all.
And I don't think you'd ever be calling a fairy wren chunky or chonky.
It depends what you start with.
That's right. It's relative, isn't it?
It's all relative.
But if you've ever handled a red wattlebird, for instance, you would ever be thinking that a fairy wren was chunky. Let's have a quick run through the next one that is pretty well known again through the interior. The splendid fairy wren.
Yeah, splendid fairy wrens are amazing. They're this bright, sort of almost turquoise blue, really vibrant blue that stands out against the sort of red dirt habitat in the outback that they live in. Seeing them in the wild is amazing. And as you can see from that range distribution, they have 3 subspecies. Each of those sort of horns on that map is a different subspecies. There's at least 3. There might even be 4. I can't remember for sure now. But yeah, they're outback specialists for the most part. But then if you go over to the West Coast, over by Perth, they are in a little bit wetter habitat over there. And it's like superb fairy wren habitat, but just on the West Coast, I would say. Yeah.
Are they a replaced species? I know my non-science terminology is probably making you both tear your hair out. But if we go back to, there's the superb fairy wren, or I always want to keep saying superb blue wren. That's how old I am. So, yeah, we've got that distribution, and then it seems like it's roughly a replacement with a different kind of habitat. But they've got to be integrating, are they?
Yeah, I've actually been to Allison and I have visited locations, or like the edge of their range, the edge of both species range there. It was either in Victoria or New South Wales. I can't remember, but maybe somewhere right on the edge of there, like the northern edge of Victoria, I think is the superb edge of their range. And we actually did find a site where there was a superb fairy wren territory right next to a splendid fairy wren territory. But other than that, we didn't canvass the area to a great extent, but it is a pretty distinct cutoff in general. We were surprised to find those 2 territories right next to one another. But otherwise, what we saw on our trips is that it goes straight from superb fairy wren to splendid fairy wren almost immediately.
And is that governed, do you think, by the type of geology or vegetation type, habitat? Why do you think the cutoff is so stark?
I think you're right. Yeah, I think it's really the habitat differences. I want to look into this further in the future if I have time. But yeah, it seems like that range edge is where you go from like farmable land with a lot greener land to outback desert, right at that border of the New South Wales Victoria border. As you move north into New South Wales, the habitat really changes. So we've stopped in Mildura. I think that's Victoria a lot. And so right across there, the habitat really changes a lot as you go north across the river. And it was somewhere around there. I can't remember where for sure, but I have notes of it where we found those 2 territories right next to one another. That was really cool because we looking back and forth at the 2 species and waiting for them to interact, but they never did.
Holly, are you a splendid fairy wren fan? Have you come across them? Obviously, the superb is living in your vicinity, as is mine. But have you seen the splendid, regularly, frequently?
Not frequently, because they're not in my home range. So I don't see them very often. The couple of opportunities I've had, they are simply remarkable. I'm pretty basic. I love me a superb. They're the most popular bird in Australia, and I'm quite happy to be on their bandwagon. I studied them for a long time in my PhD too, and I still love them. So there was certainly an opportunity for things to go horribly wrong and our relationship to sour, but I do still love a superb, and I think it's not necessarily about the look. I think it's around the behaviour. And I think that's partially because they're so well studied compared to other Australian birds in general, let alone other fairy wrens. They have that intricate social life. There is so much research looking at now about how they respond to cuckoos and teaching songs in eggs and that whole wealth of knowledge. I won't go into it anymore.
Hold on to that thought. We might come back to that. Joe, let's give just so we don't forget at the end, how good is Alison's work with the illustrations and the identification?
She is amazing. Yeah, it's funny because if you look in bird books and stuff, not all artists get fairy wrens perfect, but Alison is, I think you can't always exactly represent a bird on a 2D plane. Anything, maybe it's impossible. Like 3D, it's impossible to do that. But Alison gets the closest I think I've ever seen to getting it perfect. She is really good.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's move on to the white-winged fairy wren, because it's almost the most unique of the group when you are looking at them. But you can tell us now, Joe, is it closely related to the genetics? Have the genetics told you if it's closer to superb and splendid than it is to the other group? And that's how old I am, because they used to be, I think it was two complexes, I think was the way they were treated for a long time. So, yeah, white-winged fairy wrens are actually more closely related to red-backed fairy wrens than they are to splendids and superbs. They're white-winged fairy wrens, white-shouldered fairy wrens, which aren't on here because they're in New Guinea, and red-backed fairy wrens are all three really closely related. And white-winged fairy wrens are really interesting. Like you said, they're a desert specialist. So they're pretty much only in really dry habitats and usually in low vegetation structure. It's like salt bush and that kind of things, like even salt plains, salt flats, is extending as far as the eye can see. And you'll find these white-winged fairy wrens sitting at the tops of bushes, singing their sort of reeling song that just travels over the top of these bushes through the outback. They are really fun to see too, because they often live in really big groups. And the ornamented males, the bright males, are more rare than any other species. Maybe because of the harshness of the habitat they live in. But it seems like from past research, it appears that for the males to acquire that bright plumage, it takes anywhere from 2 to 4 years of age before they can acquire that full bright plumage. That means that this species is living longer on average than the superb and the splendid. Is that right? Not necessarily. It would take a lot of work to decide that for sure. You'd have to do a lot of banding and watching of the banded birds to figure that out for sure. But in general, when you find white-winged fairy wrens, I'd say you see fewer of these bright males than you would in a superb fairy wren population. Especially during the breeding season in a superb fairy wren population, all the males should be in the bright plumage. But if you go to a white-winged fairy wren population during the breeding season, you might only see, say, 1 out of 6 birds would be in the bright plumage. It probably varies by area, and that's one of the questions we're looking into in the Fairywren Project. But we don't know for sure. Now, there's a black and white. I was going to say phase, but that's totally wrong. It's 2 subspecies, I think. Yeah. But they're only on offshore islands, is that right? Yeah, they're only off the west coast of Australia on Dirk-Hartog Island, which is outside of Shark Bay, Australia, and Barrow Island, which is a lot further north. I forget what city it's outside of, if it's outside of any. But yeah, way further north up there, yeah. I think Barrow is close to Broome, and down here at Dirk-Hartog is down in the area. I think I've got right. You might be able to correct me, Holly. What do you think?
I think that sounds about right.
So if I go back and I use the pointer, so one of the black and white subspecies is here?
Yes.
And the other one is up around here. No, up around here.
Yeah, somewhere up there. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, it might even be up there, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. So they're quite far apart. What are the relationships? Oh, look, I'm probably asking you for work you haven't done.
Oh, you can ask because I think I know the work. So people have done this work.
Okay. So how closely related are the black and white subspecies to each other? Because there's a great geographical distance between them. And well, I guess the question is, how close are the relationship between the 2 black and white subspecies to each other, and then to each of those to the blue and white type species?
That's been a really interesting question that's been looked into multiple times over the years. And as far as we can tell, it seems like the black and white subspecies are more related to the mainland blue subspecies than they are to each other. So it seems from what we can tell that the black plumage, that black body plumage, has evolved independently twice, and at least twice, from that blue plumage. So it seems like bluebirds probably colonized those two islands and then have independently evolved that black and white plumage twice at those two islands. So the island birds are more related to the mainland bluebirds than they are to each other.
That's super interesting, isn't it, Holly? That just from an evolutionary standpoint, that you get the same mutation or adaptation, whichever it may be, independently, so far apart, but from the same, because it's almost identical, isn't it? The two black and white subspecies are almost identical in appearance.
I think so. To my eyes, from the photos I've seen, yes. I've never seen them in person. And I don't know for sure if anybody's done a study of their feathers, so like their feather structure. They might have. I can't remember if there are some cool studies on feather structure in fairy wrens, but I don't know if they included those two black and white subspecies and compared them. Yeah.
Maybe you can put me in touch with those links, and if someone wants to totally nerd out, they can follow the links off my page for this episode, and we'll let people go down the fairy wren rabbit hole. Holly, in your experience, have any other Australian birds had that kind of divergent but almost identical evolutionary path like that? Or evolutionary plumage accident?
I don't know, Grant, is my answer. Quite possibly, because there are a number of subspecies that are found on offshore islands, but I can't think of any off the top of my head that have such a dramatic plumage change. But somebody out there will correct and tell me.
Actually, I phrased it really wrong. This is my clumsy interviewing style. No, yeah, there's plenty of really divergent morphs. You only have to look at the grey goshawk or whatever to see that. But to have two vastly different morphs from the type species, but for those to be almost identical, that's the thing that I think is really amazing, because even in lots of groups where, like white-naped honeyeaters and all those that have got lots of variations in their different geographical replacements, whatever, let's not even talk about types and clines, but to have two that are so separate in geography, to be almost identical is really weird.
Yeah, look, nothing's springing to mind, but that's not to say it hasn't happened.
I will say there is a phenomenon where island subspecies tend to go black or darker. This is beyond just fairy wrens. I don't remember what it's called or if there's a name for it, and I'm not very well versed in this research, but I think there is a known phenomenon where this happens in other species as well, other bird species as well. Where
we've got the currawong, of course, is probably the logical one to think about for our blackie and whitey birds. The Tasmanian one's got very little white, and I think the King Island one is blacker.
Oh, cool. Okay.
So I'm probably wrong, but I think that's the one. Let's move on to the first of the other group.
Chestnut-shouldered group.
Yeah. So these are all, and I always thought of these as the mustachioed group as well. So, yeah, apart from their obvious difference in appearance, do this group, what have we got? I think there's going to be 6 or 7 in this group. Are they behaviourally different to the 3 species we've just talked about, or the four species we've just talked about?
Yes, the species, the purple-backed fairy wren, the chestnut-shouldered in general. I don't know if this is true for all of the species in this clade and this group, but for the purple-backed fairy wrens at least, and a few others, they're really interesting because they won't only have they'll have male helpers as well as female helpers at a nest. And so Allison has been studying the purple-backed fairy wren. She studied this species for her PhD and is continuing with it so far. And she's found that you'll have, like superb and splendid fairy wrens, you'll have a dominant pair usually. So you have a male and a female pair, but they're often joined by sons. And these sons will usually take on the bright plumage of the males. And they'll often be joined, not always, but sometimes by an unrelated female who joins the group and sometimes helps feed the offspring of the dominant pair.
Are they socially monogamous?
Yes, I think all the fairy wrens are socially monogamous, not monogamous, meaning, the male and female work together to raise offspring, but then both are mating outside of that pair bond, so they're not genetically modified.
And what's the habitat preferred by the purple-backed fairy wren?
They're more of a sort of desert scrub species as well. They're not quite as much outback specialists as the white-winged fairy wren, but they are more of a dry scrub habitat, open forest. Where Allison studies them, they're sort of in a mulga forest, so like short, stunted growth trees with many trunks and large bushes around. They nest usually in the bushes.
Okay, now you said mulga as distinct from mallee? I know.
Oh, or yeah, I guess it's mallee habitat. I'm less versed in the distinct Australian habitats as I should be. Yeah.
I'll do my best to put all that stuff in after we've got the episode out and published and whatnot on the webpage. Joe, I don't know if I'm a horticulturist as
cool.
well.
Okay.
So I'm really interested in the vegetation communities. So I try and always overlay that over the distribution maps.
Awesome, yeah.
When I'm looking at birds. So I'll see if I can come up with that. Because it's such a big distribution here. And I've travelled around a lot of Australia frequently, and I'm not confident that I've ever seen the purple-backed fairy wren. And I think that's probably because of the habitats that I've spent more time in. But it could also be that I've just completely misidentified it too, which is the next thing. Holly, have you checked this one off your list?
No, I haven't. Unfortunately, I don't know how I haven't, because I've been through some of those spots as well. But yeah, I'm missing the purple backed, and it obviously means I need a holiday. I think I need like a fairy wren themed holiday where I can just travel around.
Yes.
I actually put a map together last night, Holly, for precisely that reason, a touring map. I draw the point too, that's such a wide distribution for this species. And if we go back here, the white-winged fairy wren, super wide distribution. I reckon I've seen female white-winged fairy wrens in my travels and visiting people, but they could well have been dull males as well, because I wasn't looking that closely where I was.
If their bills haven't turned black, they're indistinguishable for white-winged fairy wrens and for red-backed fairy wrens. Even if you have them in the hand, you can't tell the difference when they're in the non-breeding plumage.
But the point of bringing that up is when we see a map like this, people think, oh, well, if I just go there, I'm likely to see it. But no, they're very closely linked to a specific habitat type in most cases. So what have we got next? The variegated fairy wren, which I have had the pleasure of seeing. So how is it? What niche does this species occupy, Joe?
This one is slightly more tropical, but not quite too tropical than the purple-backed fairy wren. So they just recently, the paper was from 2017 that actually led to the splitting of these two species. So the variegated fairy wren and the purple-backed fairy wren used to just be called the variegated fairy wren. So if you have my bird book I've got open right next to me right now is Pisian Night, and I think it still calls them just variegated fairy wrens. Yeah, for the whole species, or for the two species. So just in 2017, two papers were published that led to them being split, at least in the taxonomy that eBird uses. I'm not sure if BirdLife has split them yet or not, or if they plan to, but at least some groups are considering them two species.
I was going to go through the exercise of looking at all my bird books and see how they all treated them, but that's a futile exercise because every new edition has them all treated differently, and that's a good thing because it keeps you in work.
It does. How does BirdLife treat them, Holly? Are they?
I'm just looking now, and I think they are still lumped in with variegateds. But that may change.
Yeah, eBird only changed them, I think, last year or maybe the year before, but it's been very recent. Yeah,
I'm guessing that there are ornithologists currently shouting at the screen, going, "That's not right."
People have strong opinions, and for taxonomy, I'm just the conveyor of what other people have decided, I guess. Yeah. I'm not making the decisions. So
just don't shoot the messenger.
And also it's go with the flow. The birds don't care. If you go and ask a lovely fairy wren where he's placed on our taxonomic sliding scale, he doesn't really give a stuff, I don't think. Excuse me, caterpillar. All right, lovely fairy wren. Now, this is one that I think a lot of people have on their bucket list just simply because of where it occurs. There's the geographical range that we're displaying, which for listeners, it's the eastern fringe of Cape York down to, I'm guessing that's about Cairns, maybe Serena.
I think my friends and I saw them outside of Cairns. I think there are some spots, down there.
Yeah, I'm guessing that's at that intergrade point somewhere around Serena or whatnot. And then it goes up to the tip of Cape York, occupies the top maybe quarter of Cape York, and then a little bit of the eastern coast of the Gulf of Carpentaria, or shall we call that the Western Cape. A lot of us would assume that, gee, it's in the tropics, so it must like jungle. But it doesn't, does it?
I don't know them super well, but I know that one person who studied them was studying them in mangrove habitat. Actually, that was in Cairns, I think. Yeah.
You've got
usually, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. You've got a dense classic term here that I think, there we are, scrubby edge habitats. I reckon that might be common of most of the fairy wrens, that edge intergrade from one sort of vegetation type to another is where I see them frequently, where shrubbery becomes grassland, or for us with our urban wrens, the edge of the oval and things like that. Have you had the opportunity to get up to Cape York ever, Joe?
Not all the way to Cape York, but we were up there a little ways up there, not all the way to the tip. But we were up in Cairns and then Port Douglas, and then went up a little bit further north of there as well. And that species is really cool because those females are really neat blue. They're really unique among the fairy wrens.
Yeah, look, it's a really groovy looking bird. I reckon the females are really cool looking with their browny wings, but their bluey upper body. Okay, blue-breasted fairy wren. Now, how many have we got? That's three to go, and then I want to talk about something a little bit different. So, blue-breasted fairy wren. Let's race through that one.
So they're most people know them as from Southwest Australia, or near. I think you can get them just outside of Perth, and then in scrubby open forest habitat. If you ever go birding or talk to ornithologists in near Perth, Dryandra, I think, is the woodlands that they're really well known for, where the numbats are. They're common there, and I think they were studied there a long time ago, maybe.
It looks like, Holly, you might correct me with this as well, but it looks like it's that wheat belt zone of Western Australia and there the Eyre Peninsula, where that mallee woodland is being replaced rapidly by farmland. But does that sit with your understanding of this species?
Yeah, that tracks with me, that they're going for that sort of eucalypt woodland type habitat where it's going to be a little bit drier, and I think that's perfectly along that sort of belt for sure.
And then we might just race through the red-winged fairy wren. Now, this is the one that I always thought, this is the species and all the others are subspecies, but it's the one with the most localised distribution, the southwest corner of the continent, south of Perth down towards Albany. What's amazing about this one?
I think you could remind me of the forests. Are they those forests. So where you have the sort of what I felt like when I was there, multiple canopies, where you have the giant cherry trees that are just so tall, and then below them you have some smaller trees. And then on the ground among the ferns, you have the red-winged fairy wrens running around on the ground. So they're just in an incredible habitat to be in. Yeah, and they like ferns and dense sort of low habitat. They really riversides or like streams and creeks where the vegetation's really dense and they're hard to follow, but they're a really neat species down there.
And are they organised socially the same way as the blue-breasted and the lovely and the variegated? I mean, that they're all sort of replacements. That's the way it appears when you look at the map, that each one is replacing another in a different habitat. But do they all have a very similar society? There we go.
I think so. I don't know for sure about a couple of the species, but I think so. I don't remember for sure if the lovelies have female helpers or not. but variegates do, purplebacks do, and red wings do. I don't know about blue-breasted either. They probably do. But this in general, this clade, at least many of the species are interesting because they have females helping at the nest as well as males helping at the nest.
Okay, let's scoot down purple crown fairy wren because I reckon a lot of people have got this one on my favourite bird list. It's tropical, very definitely, but not to the most northern reaches of the country. So what habitat is this one living in? And let's go for some opinion. Why do you reckon it's so different to all the others?
Yeah, those are great questions that people have been trying to answer for quite a while. There's a lab at Melbourne, Anna Pierce's lab, is studying purple crown fairy wren. So the same lab that Ettore is in, who you talked to previously. Some of her students are studying these up in the Kimberley, I believe. And they're the one species I haven't been to see, so I don't know the habitat as well. But as far as I know, it's desert habitat, but then where you have the rivers through the outback desert, you have it's really vegetated along the rivers, and these purple crown fairy wrens are along those rivers in that really vegetated just zone of area just on both sides of the river.
I'll do some work and put some visuals in on the page, dear listener, so that you can have a look at what these different habitats look like, because the map doesn't give us any kind of indication of what you're likely to see if you were walking around up there. Holly, one for you. We've raced through the 10. What's the conservation status for most of them? Are any of them in peril?
So most of them are classified as, actually all of them I think are classified as least concern by the IUCN list. The purple-crowned the subspecies is classified as endangered.
Is that the western subspecies? Or
the western subspecies.
Okay, so that's the one inhabiting the inner Kimberley region.
Yep, that's right. Okay. So I don't think, just trying to remember, I know that the Kangaroo Island subspecies of the superbs understandably copped a beating during the fires. And so I'm not sure if their status has been reviewed or not, but I know they were one of the ones that were the population was significantly damaged. I don't think any of them are on an IUCN list aside from that western subspecies of the purple crowned.
That's good news. I don't often get to talk about good news on this show.
That's not to say that they're not in trouble and they're not facing a whole range of different threats.
That's the next question for the two of you. Joe, tell us about predation when you answer, and then Holly, if you can tell us what the major threats are for the complex and any individuals, if we need to talk about individual populations, not individuals. I think every individual is worried by goshawks. Yeah, would you like to go first? Who predates these fabulous birds?
Yeah, for adults, not many things do. There are kookaburras certainly will try, butcherbirds, any of those, or like collared sparrowhawks, and what's the other hawk? The small goshawk, brown goshawk would definitely try. They're probably too small for something like a gray goshawk to worry about. But it seems like adults in our population of the redback fairy wrens, we didn't observe extremely high predation of the adults. They seemed to stick around for quite a few years, it seemed like. The average age probably was 3 or 4, what Holly said before. But for nests, many of the nests do suffer from predation. So the redback fairy wrens that I studied will often try to nest multiple times in a season, but often only succeed with one. So only fledge one nest. But we think the biggest predator was snakes, we think. And we'd often find the nest just completely empty and not really damaged at all. So we think, say, like brown snakes and that sort of thing, would somehow find them and eat the babies when they're in the nest. Other bird predators like kookaburras and butcherbirds, we had to be careful of that we didn't lead them to the nests as well. And every once in a while, we had a trail camera caught a fox depredating a nest. But we think for the most part, snakes were the biggest predator.
Holly, the threats from things other than critters, are there any of these species or specific localities that are on your list of concerns?
There's always land clearing. With the exception of superbs really as being the most tolerant to urbanisation, shall we say. They're all under threat by clearing of habitat. They're all dependent on understory vegetation. They'll often, most of them will feed out in the open, but they're reliant on that sort of dense protective cover of veg in order to escape. Once you go in and clear and fragment habitat, opening it up means you have more predators around. The birds are not as well protected, and you have population loss. So across the board, that's a huge thing. With the purple-crowned fairy wrens being so dependent on those riparian stretches of dense vegetation, you get inappropriate fire regimes clearing out that habitat. You get invasive plants coming in and changing the structure as well in those areas. Conversely, for things like variegateds and superbs, particularly probably redback fairy wrens as well, sometimes weedy habitat's actually really important. So as much as it pains me to say it, fairy wrens love lantana. It provides that really dense structure that is going to protect them from predators and enable them to duck in and out and do their foraging. I know that I think the way we approach weed management now for small birds has changed, and it's in that whole clear it all out and blanket flatten everything actually does a lot of damage for things like fairy wrens and a range of small birds, really, that any of that weed removal actually has to be done really cautiously, and we see lots of people taking that approach now. Across the board, it's always loss of habitat, simplification of habitat structure. If they don't have that dense protective layer, they're in big trouble. And we see climate change is going to pose a risk for some of these guys. There's more evidence now. Was it superbs changing breeding time to do with changing climate? Joe, is that ringing a bell with you? It's ringing a bell off the top of my head.
Yeah, a study from the Canberra group, I believe, where they've studied superbs for many years in a row. The timing of breeding was associated with temperature. So warmer temperatures led to earlier breeding in superbs, I believe. And there was also something with the end of breeding, but I don't remember that result as well.
And the world's a complex place, so you would think that's got an effect on the availability of food and everything, so everything's shifting. But what I was wondering, Holly, based on what you said about the changing in the way we manage disturbed locations and changed ecosystems, and that we're not tidying up every piece of land nowadays, are the group, and Joe, chip in with this too, in general, this group of species, are they doing well on agricultural land? Because we still keep most agricultural land devoid of undergrowth. And does that mean that corridors and remnant vegetation is crucial to the ongoing success of each species, but the group in general? What's your view on that?
Do you want to go first, Joe, or do you want me to?
You can go first.
You notice from those distribution maps that a lot of these birds overlap with agricultural habitat, but they are reliant on the forested areas of those edges of forests with agricultural habitat. And clearing for grazing and removing understory, for example, is going to have a huge impact. There was some bird life research that came out just recently that showed that where that habitat was planted back in, fairy wrens were one of the quick colonisers, the ones that were coming back and into those agricultural areas relatively fast.
The reason for asking was that superbs are really successful as garden birds in the southeast. So, but you don't see them around on ovals and things like that very often. So I just wondered if the density of vegetation...
It's around that proximity to vegetation. Yeah. A big oval is very open. Yeah. A garden has lots of little places to hide away a lot quicker. So they seem to be one of the fairy wrens that's most tolerant to people being around. They're not as shy as even something like a variegated that tend to stick very close and require a bit more density. There's still a limit to how much open space or how much lawn is appropriate for them.
That's right. And the edge effect, when you see those words on paper, that never really accurately reflects what's gone on any piece of land. So, Joe, you're looking at the fairy wrens from afar. How do you think they're tracking? And as an American, do you think Australians in general are aware of the whole fairy wren group?
I think they're aware of superb fairy wrens, which is great because Holly said they're an amazing species. All these species are amazing, but superbs are a wonderful flagship species for this family, for this group. I think probably most Australians are not aware of all the diversity. And I remember, so the first time, when I first saw splendid fairy wrens and white-winged fairy wrens in Western Queensland out at I forget if it's Bush Heritage or AWC might own I'm forgetting the name, out by Cunnamulla, Queensland. There's a wildlife refuge area out there. Bowra, Bowra, I believe, wildlife refuge. I drove from Brisbane out to there about 10 hours and first saw these bright blue splendid fairy wrens on this sort of clay pan outback red dirt habitat. And that sort of just sold it for me that I really wanted to continue working with this group of birds and just try and understand more about them. And yeah, seeing them for the first time just sold it for me. That was what I wanted to do. And they're just one of the coolest families of birds out there.
Now, Holly, I'm watching the time. So tell us about cuckoos.
Yeah. When most people think of cuckoos, they think of the big urban cuckoos, so the cobels and channelbills that arrive along the east coast and drive people nuts. And I get an influx of emails asking what on earth is that bird that's calling all night. But there are a range of smaller native cuckoos across Australia, and a number of them use fairy wrens as their hosts. And so there's this really interesting evolutionary arms race going on amongst the cuckoos and the fairy wrens to try and outwit and outlast each other. And research out of Canberra, I believe, was finding that the superb fairy wren females were singing a certain note or a song to their eggs. And because the cuckoo eggs were laid later, they didn't have enough, the theory is they don't have enough time to actually learn this little call. And so if the chicks that hatch from the eggs do not repeat that call to her, they don't get fed. So effectively that means that the cuckoo chick goes hungry and the fairy wren chicks get fed and grow. And so it's not a situation, of course, that works all the time. It depends on the timing of when eggs are laid and everything, but it's a really interesting way that superb fairy wrens are evolving in an attempt to outwit the cuckoo.
That's pretty astounding stuff, isn't it? I don't know why I am there. I don't even want to be there. Let's get us back there. That's better. That is pretty astounding, and it just shows there's so much we don't understand about how birds learn what they must do to win the evolutionary battle. But that is great. Is there a link to that research or something that we can direct people to? Great.
Yeah, there's lots of those. I'll send you something.
I'll get that and put that on the page as well. We've got to almost the end of the time that Holly has for us, but I want to draw attention to a couple of things. There is a wren project that is currently going on that is not the Fairywren Project, and that's Superb City Wrens. There's a link again on thebirdemergency.com/fairywrens. Don't go right now because the page isn't up because we're still doing the show. But that's about the superb fairy wren in Melbourne particularly. And Joe, we haven't really talked about the citizen science aspect of the Fairywren Project, but what do you need people to do to help you out?
Yeah, check out our website, fairywrenproject.org. We're looking for citizen scientists, photographers, anyone to help us look at plumage types of fairy wrens. We're trying to understand how fairy wren plumage is, when they produce this bright plumage, how that's related to environmental conditions. So if it's a really dry year or drought year, does that delay when males are producing this fancy bright breeding plumage? And then we're also looking at how group sizes, so how crop litter breeding behavior varies across different environments. So Allison and I have done some transects of our own. We start from wet coastal Victoria and go north into outback New South Wales to look at group sizes along this transect to see how superb fairy wrens and purpleback fairy wrens are changing their group sizes as we go from wet to dry habitats. And we're trying expand, see if our results match sort of continental results. So you can be anywhere in Australia and send us data through eBird. You can check out our website for the instructions. But we're trying to see if species are changing their cooperative breeding behavior based on the environment they live in as well.
Fantastic. It's such a massive project. It's going to be ongoing. So, Joe, I hope we can get you back and Alison when she's available. And,
Definitely.
Hey, let's get Kylie and Ettore in as well and just nerd out on fairy wrens. And, of course, Holly, you want people to go and check out what's going on at birdsinbackyards.net. What
Absolutely.
is the current thing? People might have seen you on the news.
Yes. Always talking rat poisons with another mouse plague around the corner and impacts on wildlife and pets from some research we've done recently. So, actforbirds.org/rat poison for lots of info on what we're doing there and getting some advice on how to deal with rats and mice around your place. You can always do a bird survey for us and tell us maybe you have fairy wrens in the garden if you're lucky. I don't, unfortunately. I've had a dispersing pair visit my house and I got very excited. They called through and stopped on the shed and I was like, this is it. They've finally come. And then they were off. They didn't stay. It's my plan and my wish to get the nearby fairy wrens to incorporate my garden within a territory. It's yet to happen. I have a lot of wandering cats around my place, so it's probably not a great space. So people can do a Birds in Backyard survey at any time. And then what else? If you're interested in gang cockatoos, we're about to have a great learning course available for people to take part and learn about gangs. Check out.
And we'll no doubt be talking about that soon. Joe, Holly was interviewed on the news about rodenticides and the particular channel showed a whole lot of footage of rodenticides in the big hardware store and the supermarkets, and then talked to Holly about the problem. And they emphasised before they introduced Holly that vets all over the country are having to treat pets that are getting poisoned, and then they go into this great montage of products, but they didn't say which ones to avoid. So they've ticked off, we have done our bit for conservation and the problem. Bloody useless, I'm sorry to say, even though Holly looked fantastic in the Bird Life T-shirt.
Thank you. And I did talk. It obviously got cut.
Yeah, the introductory ramble was quite long, a bit like the way I talk, but Holly was like this big. And no doubt you said avoid these products, but it's the problem with promoting through a commercial body is that if it's the slightest bit bad for business, they don't include it. But they still tick off that when they go to their management meeting and talk about, look how how environmentally responsible we are, we talked about conservation. But it was useless. It's greenwashing of the highest order.
Look, I'm not going to get into debate about it. Being able to actually share a message like that with a massive audience so you're not just talking to the converted is always an opportunity. And certainly I got to talk to two different channels that are normally not one that would ever touch what we talk about. So that was a win.
And we've got to celebrate the wins, but I think we can't let them get away with being slack and lazy is my point. It's National Volunteer Week. Obviously, citizen science and a lot of these bird projects rely on the input of volunteers. So I just wanted to say thank you very much. I appreciate what you do, and every time you fill in the Aussie bird count, your local bird count, wherever you are in the world using eBird, good on you. You are doing something valuable. And hey, if you're out there pulling weeds or making fences, ripper. Keep it up. Dr. Joe Welklin, thanks so much. Been a pleasure to meet you. I hope we can do this again as your research ticks along, and that whenever Alison is available, let's talk wrens again. Dr. Holly Parsons, Birds in Backyards, BirdLife Australia. Thanks for being with us again, Holly. Thanks for those watching. Nobody asked any questions, Joe, so you had to put up with me.
It was fun all the same, Grant. Thank you.
We're not going to call it the Monday Megaphone anymore, Holly, because I thought I don't need to be that shouty all the time. So it's just Mondays with Holly until I can come up with a better idea. So this has been Mondays with Holly on the Bird Emergency. Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Holly.
Thank you both. This was really fun.
Oh, yeah, let's do a corny wave. Let's make that our thing now.